The McDonnell F3H Demon. Nice. Was a subsonic, swept-wing, carrier-based jet fighter aircraft that was designed by McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, introduced to the U.S. Navy in 1956. It had a length of 59 feet, a wingspan of 35 feet 4 inches, a height of 14 feet 7 inches, a gross weight of 33,900 pounds, and they were powered by a single Allison J71A2E afterburning turbojet engine, capable of delivering 9,700 pounds of force dry, but 14,750 pounds of force with an afterburner. Their maximum speed at sea level was 716 miles per hour, but if they were higher, 30,000 feet, that would drop to 647 miles per hour, but still a decent clip for a subsonic jet. They had a range of 1,370 nautical miles, could fly for about 3 hours, had a service ceiling of 35,050 feet, and a rate of climb of 12,795 feet per minute. They were armed with 4 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons. They could also be equipped with 4 AIM-7 Sparrow or AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, as well as up to 6,000 pounds of bombs. Now, the Demons did not serve for very long, but not because they were inherently bad or anything. They just wound up being more of a stepping stone. A lot of lessons were learned from development on the Demon, and its design would evolve to eventually become the legendary F-4 Phantom II. As such, one could look at the Demon and refer to it as the mother of the Phantom, since without this aircraft, we may never have got the F-4s. In the late 1940s, the existence of the Soviet Union's MiG-15 fighter program was actually unknown to U.S. intelligence. But the U.S. Navy still anticipated that there would likely be high-performance Soviet jet fighters in the future, and would issue requirements for a swept-wing naval fighter on May 21, 1948. McDonnell was one of 6 aircraft companies to produce a response to this, and development work started in 1949. With the swept wing being a requirement, roll control was achieved via ailerons augmented by a compact spoiler, and both horizontal and vertical tail surfaces were also swept back. This aircraft was actually their first swept wing design, and was among the first American aircraft that was designed to be primarily armed with missiles rather than cannons. And in order to fill every one of the Navy's requirements, they did agree to power the aircraft with the Westinghouse J40 engine, which was still under development at the time, and this would prove to be a problem. The J40 was a disaster in every sense of the word. While the engine promised very good capabilities, it really never achieved that with any degree of reliability, which was kind of the issue. They just never worked. But Navy officials were really behind it early on, because it promised a thrust of over 11,000 pounds of force, which was 3 times the engines that were used on the McDonnell F2H Banshee. And in the early days, it wasn't known what a fiasco the J40 would become. McDonnell went ahead and produced 2 XF3H1 prototypes, though it was considered a fallback measure to the more unconventional Douglas F4D Skyray, which is its own story, and they envisioned the aircraft as day fighters. Development probably would have taken much more of a backseat if not for the sudden appearance of the MiG-15s during the Korean War. When that happened, the US military realized they were behind when it came to fighter design. The Navy contacted McDonnell and made it clear that the Demon was a top priority. The MiGs outclassed both the Panther and the Banshee, and while the Air Force managed to scramble and get the F-86 Sabre into service, that was, well, the Air Force. The Navy didn't have anything. They started pushing McDonnell to heavily redesign the airplane, reorienting them from short-range interceptors to medium-range all-weather fighters, which is great and all, but these adaptations would add 7,000 pounds of weight to the Demons, which impacted their performance in the end. But the Navy really was worried about this, and in March of 1951, they hastily ordered 150 F-3H-1Ns into production. They ordered it without even reviewing the mock-up. Heck, the prototype wouldn't even first fly until August 7th. They were really panicking about the MiG situation. Fortunately, though, the prototype actually was alright. Test pilot Robert Edholm found it really easy to fly and fairly maneuverable, with responsive controls, but he also noticed she was underpowered, which severely impacted high-altitude performance. The first test flights of the operational design didn't actually happen until January of 1953, and by that point, the Korean War was coming to an end. One of the biggest problems they ran into during development was the stupid J-40 engine. As I mentioned earlier, the things were, frankly, just complete pieces of junk. On the rare occasion they functioned, they only produced half of the expected power, and they suffered from a restricted flight envelope and frequent compressor stalls. James Smith McDonnell himself, the president of the company, personally wrote to Washington, warning them that the engine was garbage. He didn't say it that way. He said that it would be a disappointingly underpowered combination, which is fun business code for garbage. He requested to substitute a different engine, but the US Navy at the time persisted with the J-40 in the hopes that it would bear fruit. But Westinghouse eventually showed that they couldn't progress smoothly on the project, and the whole thing turned into a complete mess as time went on. 35 of the F3H-1Ns were flown with J-40s installed. 8 of them were involved in major accidents. The first production Demons were actually grounded after the loss of 6 aircraft and 4 pilots. It was a disaster, and eventually McDonnell got their way. All the remaining Demons on order that were supposed to use J-40s were either cancelled or redesigned to use other engines. But the other problem was, the original Demons that had been constructed couldn't be easily remodeled to fit new engines. They needed their wings and fuselage completely redesigned and enlarged. The associated costs and delays were bad enough that the Navy considered cancelling development of the Demon as a whole. But fortunately for McDonnell, that did not happen. The best alternative was the Allison J-71, but even they had their issues when they were used to power an aircraft of the Demon's size. They would suffer from flameouts and compressor stalls. Also, the Demon's injection seat was not really reliable. McDonnell had made them in-house, and theirs had problems, so they had to replace them with Martin Baker ejection seats, which were becoming the standard US Navy seat of choice due to higher performance at low altitude, also the fact that they generally worked. Despite all these problems, the Demons would serve briefly. The Navy would place an order for 239 F3H-2s. The first batch was deployed in March of 1956, and a total of 519 Demons were constructed before production was terminated. Pilots, if they didn't call it the Demon, would call them the Chair, because one of McDonnell's biggest pushes with the Demon was to enhance pilot visibility. The nose had been tilted downwards by 10 degrees late in development, and the windscreen was changed multiple times to provide the best view possible, and pilots actually loved the plane for this trait. Demon pilots were also referred to as Demon drivers, while the ground crews were called Demon doctors. The pilots also really liked the planes for their flying characteristics, as well as high level of stability when being flown at high altitude. They were also inherently easy to land, so in many ways they were a very solid design, but they always had one problem that held them back. When they were annoyed with them, the pilots also called them lead sleds, because their engines were just never that powerful. As I mentioned when I talked about their development, a lot of weight had to be added to get them to where the Navy wanted them, but as a result, they always felt underpowered. Easy to fly and land? Yeah, they're great for that, but in terms of acceleration they left a lot to be desired. A reconnaissance version was also proposed, but never built, and despite their shortcomings, they were flown as the US Navy's frontline fighter until 1962. It was during the late 50s that McDonnell had started pushing for a Super Demon, as they called it, a solid improvement on the overall Demon design. There's a misconception that they jumped straight to the Voodoo after the Demon, and then to the Phantom. But that's not true. For one thing, the Voodoo was an Air Force plane, and it was derived from the earlier XF-88 Voodoo, which, to be fair, did influence the Demon in some ways, but the Demon was an entirely separate thing in most regards, and it directly led to the Phantom, though it is worth mentioning that all the planes bear many similarities. The Demon would eventually give rise to the Phantom, which is arguably one of the best jet fighters ever, especially in their day. But unfortunately, this meant that the mother of the Phantom, the Demon, hardly had any time to really shine. They claimed no aerial victories during their service life, as they really just never had a chance to get any. And in September of 1964, the final Demon-equipped squadron, VF-161 Chargers, traded in their Demons for the new F-4 Phantom IIs. Most would be scrapped after that, though 3 did manage to survive, fortunately. 1370-78 is at the National Museum of Naval Aviation at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida. 1335-66 is at the USS Intrepid Museum in New York City. And 1452-21 is at the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. While the Demon doesn't get much love in the modern day and is often overlooked, personally I think they deserve a lot more appreciation. Yeah, they were underpowered, but let's be real, the whole fiasco with the J-40 was not their fault at all, and McDonnell clearly knew they were onto something with the overall layout of the Demon, which is why they evolved it. It is the most produced American supersonic military aircraft in history. Maybe there isn't a heck of a lot you can say about the actual Demon itself, but if her kid's anything to go by, she's a great mom. Well, a few days ago, we brought up the Douglas F4D Skyray, because one hit a train. Well, actually, the train hit it, because it wound up on the tracks. There's a whole video about that. We don't talk about that here. What we are going to discuss is the Skyray in and of itself, since at least one person asked me to go into more detail regarding the development of this particular aircraft, as it's not brought up very much, and the reason for that is simply that it didn't serve for very long. A little less than 10 years, in fact. It was a carrier-based fighter interceptor, designed and produced by Douglas, and it was later redesignated to the F6 Skyray, but it's the same plane no matter what. It had a crew of 1, a length of 45 feet 3 inches, a wingspan of 33 feet 6 inches, a height of 13 feet exactly, and their maximum takeoff weight was 27,116 pounds. They were powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57P8, an 8A or an 8B afterburning turbojet engine that was capable of delivering 10,200 pounds in thrust dry, but 16,000 with an afterburner. Their maximum speed was 722 miles per hour at sea level. They had a range of 610 nautical miles, a surface ceiling of 55,000 feet, and they were armed with 4 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannons. They could also carry unguided rockets, 6 pods of 7 or 4 pods of 19. They could also carry 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles or 2 2,000-pound bombs. They were equipped with an APQ-50A radar and an Aero 13F fire control radar. The origin of the Skyray actually dates back to a design study that was performed by Douglas and funded by the United States Navy, known as D-571-1. The study was for a pure interceptor capable of climbing extremely fast by the standards of the time, and used a delta wing configuration, to be powered by 2 Westinghouse J-34 turbojet engines. This particular design had a pretty thick wing and no conventional fuselage, besides a pod-like cockpit, similar to a flying wing, except it did have a tail. It based itself on a lot of German research, particularly work done by aerodynamicist Alexander Lippisch, who had moved to the United States after the end of World War II. His work had been examined by Douglas's design team, and they took advantage of some of the stuff he figured out. The results of the study did interest the Navy, so they issued a contract in June of 1947 to proceed with preliminary investigation and engineering works on the concept up to the mock-up stage. Over time, the aircraft that would eventually become the Skyray began to take shape. One of the first changes was a significant reduction to the wing's thickness to reduce drag and therefore increase high-speed capabilities. They also threw out the idea of using 2 J-34 engines and instead opted to go for a single Westinghouse J-40 engine. That was a really bad idea. But at the time they wouldn't have known this. As I mentioned when I talked about the Demon, the J-40 was a complete disaster. It never worked right, and was cancelled. So this would significantly hamper progress on the Skyray as it had with the Demon. But we'll go into more detail in a bit. Since, again, at the time they chose to do this, it wasn't known how bad the J-40 would wind up. The early design only used a single hydraulic system, so they had to add measures to permit manual reversion in the event of a failure. The early design focused on the primary armament being rockets, housed in pylon-mounted pods. The Navy did issue a formal operational requirement in 1948, and while technically other companies could submit proposals in line with the requirement, it was already pretty clear that Douglas was gonna get it no matter what. The Navy at the time was looking for a very powerful interception aircraft that could destroy enemies at an altitude of 50,000 feet within 5 minutes of the alarm being sounded. They were worried about threats posed to their carrier battle groups by high-altitude Soviet bombers. And while jets were certainly the future, at the time they had significant difficulties. For one thing, they burned through fuel like crazy, and as a result they had very limited endurance. Plus, many of them didn't climb quite as well as what the Navy wanted. They wanted a new jet that could reach its operational altitude extremely quickly. So that's what Douglas focused on with the Skyray. However, there were a bunch of design changes that did delay the mock-up review by almost a year, though it did eventually get looked at by the Navy in March of 1949. The Navy had some criticisms, though not too many. Their concern mostly was the nose. The nose-up attitude was greater than had been anticipated, and they were worried about the pilot's external visibility, so Douglas would have to make some slight modifications there. But the biggest problem that was starting to crop up was the J-40 engine, which, like I said, was no. As such, Douglas's design team decided to make accommodations that would facilitate the use of other engines as a contingency in case the J-40 never came to fruition. Which it didn't, so that was a good call. The prototype would therefore be outfitted with an Allison J-35 instead of the J-40. But that wasn't a long-term solution. The J-35 wasn't as strong as the J-40 promised, and while they were decent engines, they weren't going to be able to push the Skyray to the performance that Douglas needed. So the long-term replacement for the J-40 was actually the Pratt & Whitney J-57. It was more powerful, but the problem with it was that it was considerably larger than the J-35. The original inlet design on the Skyray was not a good match for the J-57. It would not work. They would have to make significant redesigns to make sure it fit, and that caused significant delays in the overall project. The first production standard Skyray wouldn't even fly until June of 1954, and even there were still some issues. The aft section, for example, needed to be reprofiled to eliminate some undesirable buffeting that was occurring, and to reduce drag. Production aircraft weren't delivered until early 1956, though the planes were declared ready for fleet operation in April of that year. And they were distinctive. The one thing they retained the entire time was that big old delta wing. They're named for it, in fact, as they looked like manta rays. Their unique profile actually led to them being one of the most recognizable early jet fighters. You could tell if you were looking at the Skyray generally. Really, there was nothing else quite like it, at least when it came to America. During April of 1956, the squadron, known as VC-3, was the first to obtain operational status with the Skyray. And the Navy weren't the only ones to utilize it. The Marines also took advantage of the planes, and by September of 1962 they were no longer called the F4D, but instead the F6A Skyrays. This was done due to the Department of Defense choosing to adopt the Uniform Aircraft Designation System, to keep everything a lot more consistent across the board. The Navy had to fall in line with the U.S. Air Force's aircraft designation system, and therefore the Skyray was redesignated. Hence why F4D Skyray shouldn't be confused with the D variant of the McDonnell Douglas F4, as these are two completely different planes, but most of you probably already knew that. Now in terms of the aircraft's performance and service, well, they did do exactly what they were supposed to do. Some people consider them a failure because of their short service life, but that's not fair to them, because Douglas did exactly what the Navy asked them to do, create an interceptor that could climb really fast. And they did it. Even with the issues with the engine, the Skyray wound up setting a new time-to-altitude record, flying from a standing start to 49,221 feet in just 2 minutes and 36 seconds at a 70-degree pitch angle. So, if they were so good at that, why didn't they stick around a lot longer? Well, frankly, it's because that's all they were good at. They were good for that one thing and nothing else. They weren't a flexible platform. Douglas had created a very specialized jet, and that's fine, but by the time the Skyray was ready, the Navy's needs had changed quite a bit. The demand now was for aircraft with multi-mission capabilities, and the Skyray was just not cut out for this. It really could only do the interception role. Other aircraft became available that were much more flexible in this regard, like the aforementioned F4, which frankly could do pretty much whatever you wanted. There's a reason we built so many of them, because they could be utilized for a lot of different roles. The Skyray just couldn't. You couldn't really use it that well for ground attack. You couldn't really use it that well as a dogfighter. It was meant to intercept. And yeah, it was great for that, but there were other aircraft available that could do that and a whole bunch of other things too. That's why the Skyray slowly fell out of favor, and the last operational squadron flew the Skyray until February of 1964. Though a few Skyrays, 4 to be precise, were used for experiments by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which was later renamed to NASA. So they were still good as testing platforms just because of their unique capabilities. The Skyray sadly got a bit of a bad lot, since at the end of the day, by the time they were in service, their purpose had largely passed them by. They never really got a chance to shine, even though, for what they were built for, they were really good at it. It's just they weren't really good at much else beyond that exact thing. They were too specialized. Douglas actually didn't give up on the overall concept, though. They did try to push the design further, and created the Douglas F5D Skylancer. 4 of those would wind up being built, and by all regards they were actually very good. They were much faster than the Skyray, for example, and offered much more modern capabilities. To be honest, the only reason they weren't accepted was because of economic concerns, believe it or not. That may sound weird, but it was because, at the time, the Skylancer's capabilities weren't that different from the Vought F8 Crusader that was already on order. And Douglas, in particular, was already building a very large portion of the Navy's airplanes. And if they gave them another contract, that would push them even closer to having a monopoly on aircraft production when it came to the Navy. They didn't want to allow that, so the F5D was rejected, not because it was bad, but because they just didn't want to give Douglas any more of the market share. 2 of those wound up with NASA as well for further testing, and both the NASA ones actually wound up being preserved and are on display at 2 different museums. The Skyray also got lucky and had a pretty decent amount of preservation. There are at least 7 production Skyrays on static display, as well as an example of the original prototype. And due to their unique features, they are a lot of people's favorites, even though they didn't last very long. They have a distinctive appeal about them, and it's just a shame they never really got to shine. But that's how technology progresses sometimes. You make one thing, but almost immediately, it's already obsolete. That's kind of what happened with the Skyray. They were not bad, it's just that their time had simply passed them by. The Vought F7U Cutlass was a United States Navy carrier-based jet fighter, as well as a fighter bomber. It was also a problem. Just a bit of a problem. It was the first tailless production fighter in the United States, the Navy's first jet equipped with swept wings, as well as the first to be designed with afterburners in mind. So there were a lot of cool additions going into this craft, but given it was an ambitious project, it resulted in some difficulties. Naval aviators nicknamed it the Gutless Cutlass or the Ensign Eliminator, mostly because of its astonishing accident record that was high. Very, very high. They actually had the highest accident rate of all Navy swept-wing fighters in a study conducted by Chance Vought themselves in 1957. Accidents that involved the Cutlass also had a habit of being way worse than other aircraft, and by the end of their short career, they had managed to kill 4 test pilots and 21 US Navy pilots. So, yeah, not really a solid showing. There were a lot of reasons for the Cutlass's problems, But in terms of the way they were supposed to work, they had a crew of one, a length of 41 feet 3.5 inches, a wingspan of 39 feet 8 inches when the wings were open, but their wings could fold, bringing them down to 22.3 feet so they could be stored more effectively on carriers. Their maximum takeoff weight was 31,643 pounds, and most of them used two Westinghouse J-46 afterburning turbojet engines, which could deliver 4,600 pounds of force dry and 6,000 pounds of force with the afterburners enabled. I say most of them, as some didn't use the J-46, but again, more on that later. These engines could push them to a maximum speed of 697 miles per hour, which is a pretty impressive display for the early 50s, and they are equipped with four 20mm M3 cannons, as well as four hardpoints, with a capacity of 5,500 pounds. The thing about the Cutlass, more than anything else, is that they were ambitious, very ambitious, and had a lot of really interesting design attributes. But because of that, there were a lot more kinks to work out. Many of those would never be. Development on the Cutlass was started in response to a competition organized by the United States Navy. They were looking for a new carrier-capable day fighter, and the whole thing was actually launched before the end of World War II, though just barely, June 1st, 1945. The requirements were that the aircraft needed to fly at speeds up to 600 miles per hour, as well as altitudes of up to 40,000 feet. Vaught's response was considered a relatively radical design for the time. As stated, it was a very unconventional tailless configuration, a design choice that was influenced by aerodynamic data obtained by the German Arado and Messerschmitt companies. Vought denied their influence at the time, but no, they took a lot of data from the Germans. More specifically, a former Messerschmitt AG senior designer, Waldemar Voigt, who had supervised the development of many experimental jet fighters for Germany during World War II, contributed directly to the design of the Cutlass. The plane also wound up being the last aircraft designed by Rex Beisel, who not only was responsible for the first fighter ever designed specifically for the US Navy, the Curtiss TS-1, but he had also designed the Corsair, which most of you are probably already familiar with. Vaught's submission was designated number V346, and later received the official designation of F7U, when it was announced that Vought had actually won. The reason for Vaught's selection was that, while it was very unconventional, not only did they think it posed an acceptable level of risk, but incredibly, Vaught's submission was actually less radical than a lot of the other competing submissions. In June of 1946, an initial order for 3 F7U-1 prototypes, which were to be powered by Westinghouse J-34 turbojet engines, was issued, and construction took place at Vaught's plant in Stratford, Connecticut. The first prototype took to the skies on September 29, 1948, and she was piloted by Vaught's chief test pilot J. Robert Baker. It was also about this time that the Navy announced the aircraft would be nicknamed Cutlass, and during flight testing, one of the prototypes managed to hit a maximum speed of 625 miles per hour. And while Vought did receive a contract to manufacture 88 F7U-2 Cutlasses for the Navy in September of 1949, testing, development, and production didn't go very smoothly at all. First of all, none of the original 14 F7U-1s that were constructed between 1950 and 1952 were approved for any squadron service, the Navy favoring the updated model. But interestingly, the Dash 2 would never even make it to service either. They would move on to the F7U-3, which did incorporate a lot of refinements that came out of flight tests of the Dash 1, but still had a lot of problems. For one thing, initially the Cutlass was supposed to use the Westinghouse J-34 engines, but that was a bad idea. Not because the J-34s necessarily didn't work, they were no more unreliable than the vast majority of available jet engines at the time, but they were considered underpowered. In the end, most of the Dash 3s were given the Westinghouse J-46 engine instead, and that did give them better thrust, but they still weren't necessarily great. The Navy almost canceled the entire project, but because of the J-40 project, which I've mentioned multiple times in the past, they had no choice but to continue pursuing the Cutlass. The J-40 held back a lot of other planes that were being produced for the Navy, including both the Demon and the Skyray. Because of delays involving that stupid engine, the Navy had no solid alternative readily to take the place of the Cutlass, so they had to continue with development, even though testing was showing that there were some issues that they really needed to focus on. On July 7th, 1950, Vought test pilot Paul Thayer had to eject from his burning prototype directly in front of an airshow crowd, and Vought repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with the J-34 engine they were still fiddling with at the time. Even when the improved Dash 3 performed its maiden flight, there were notable issues. Test pilot Wally Schirra, who would later go on to be an astronaut, wrote in his own autobiography that he considered the Cutlass to be accident-prone and a widowmaker. There were positive attributes of the planes, as other pilots considered it a stable weapons platform, very maneuverable, as well as having a phenomenal roll rate of 570 degrees a second, which was way faster than the vast majority of available jets at the time. But for every positive, there was an equal negative. The Cutlass had really questionable stall characteristics. They apparently gyrated after experiencing a stall. Another test pilot ran into this problem, and right before ejecting, his Cutlass actually self-corrected herself, so he was able to land the plane. Further research involving wind tunnel testing showed that the standard recovery procedures for stalls that apply to literally every other aircraft didn't apply to the Cutlass. Based on this, it's pretty clear that the Cutlass didn't just have issues, but even the issues that could be addressed required an entirely different set of rules to play by when compared to every other plane. Another interesting element of the plane is that they were given all hydraulic flight controls, which would provide artificial feedback so the pilot could feel aerodynamic forces acting on the plane. But the hydraulic system operated at 3,000 psi, which was twice that of other Navy aircraft. The system was not ready for frontline service and experienced huge problems. And part of that was Vaught's fault. They had utilized components that were rated for lower pressure hydraulic systems, which, no, they weren't meant for the 3,000 psi. Another fun issue involved flameouts, which the engines like to do a lot for a whole number of reasons, though one of them was discovered by John Glenn, who's also an astronaut, go figure. You probably heard his name before. He found the muzzle blast from the 20mm cannons had a habit of causing flameouts, which was bad. You really didn't want to have a flameout in the middle of shooting your guns. Admittedly, that specific cause for flameouts was solved when the guns were fitted with what was in effect a muzzle brake or a recoil compensator. Basically, it diverted the muzzle blast away from the jet intakes, so that was no longer really an issue, but there were other problems. The nose gears were very tall and had a habit of failing, which could potentially cause spinal injuries if they failed during landing. Oh yeah, and 16 of the Dash 3s used the J-35, and those were known to flame out in rain. And you know, I feel like that's just something that should be solved at some point. Very few squadrons would actually make deployments with the Cutlass. Most would beach them ashore during part of their cruises due to operational difficulties. Despite being designed for carrier duties, the Cutlass didn't like the carriers at all. They didn't get along. And that's not to mention the Cutlass's use with the Blue Angels, the Navy Flight Demonstration Squadron, the naval equivalent of the Thunderbirds for the United States Air Force. As you can imagine, since these are demonstration teams and do a variety of awesome wicked stunts, only the best pilots get to fly with them, and indeed the Blue Angels did utilize two F7U-1 Cutlasses, numbers 124426 and 124427. But this was just as a side demonstration during their 1953 show season. They were not used for the main squadron, but it was in an effort to promote the new aircraft. However, it was quickly found that the planes were just awful. Both the Blue Angels pilots and ground crews hated the things, to the point they didn't even want to fly them at all, but there were political pressures at the time pushing the Navy to adopt the Cutlass. And reluctantly, the squadron still took them into the air, but not without serious bad effect. Listed among the failures were landing gear issues, hydraulic failures, engine fires while in the air, and on at least one occasion, one of the landing gear doors on a Cutlass fell. Like, fell off while the plane was flying. Like, entirely, just detached. Like, what? And it landed on a spectator grandstand. which could have been horrific, but it actually didn't manage to hit anyone. It was dumb luck, but yeah, that happened. During the Blue Angels' first airshow appearance in 1953, pilot Lieutenant Edward Whitey Theitner, who was also the former program manager for the F7U, experienced a total loss of hydraulics on a full afterburner takeoff, as well as a steep climb. But he remained calm and waited to gain enough altitude for an ejection. But as a result of this, he wound up with the aircraft long enough for the backup system to come on, as yes, the Cutlass did have backup hydraulics. They weren't that terrible. He wound up clipping a few trees on the end of the runway, which caused a flame out with the left engine, because of course it did, and with hydraulic fluid streaming back out of the plane, it caught alight, giving the watching crowd a heck of a show as he made a hard turn and managed to land the thing back on the runway. Onlookers loved it because it probably looked awesome, to be fair, but that is not what was supposed to happen at all. Later, while the squadron was simply traveling to another air show at Naval Air Station Glenview in Chicago, Illinois, another pilot, Lieutenant Harding McKnight, experienced a random engine flameout on his own Cutlass, which forced him to make an emergency landing at NAS Glenview. Theitner was with him, and he was redirected to make his own landing at Chicago's former Orchard Air Park, which at the time had only recently been expanded and renamed to what you probably know of it as now, O'Hare. The runway was just finished and covered with peach baskets to prevent aircraft from actually landing until it was ready to open. Theitner was told to ignore the baskets, and he landed on the new runway. Though through a stunning display of random chance and ineptitude, Theitner's F7U Cutlass wound up becoming the first aircraft to land on the new runway for Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. The more you know. Following both these incidents, the two Cutlasses were deemed unsuitable for demonstration flying, which was a really polite way of saying they were hot garbage, and they were flown to Naval Air Station Memphis, Tennessee, where they were abandoned to become aircraft maintenance instructional airframes instead for the Naval Technical Training Center. All this combined meant that the Navy had to do something about the Cutlass. They could not tolerate it anymore. The poor safety record caused Vice Admiral Harold M. Martin, who was the air commander of the United States Pacific Fleet, to immediately replace the Cutlass with the Grumman Cougar. An outstanding order for 250 of the ground attack variant of the Cutlass was cancelled, and the aircraft would officially be retired March 2nd, 1959. Surplus planes would later be donated to various municipalities and schools for display in an effort to promote aviation. That may seem like an odd choice, but let's be fair about this. For all their problems, for all the people they got killed, the Cutlass looked pretty cool, and I think that was their thought. The legacy of the Cutlass is one of, well, mostly misfortune. I do think most of their problems had to do with the unknown. There were a lot of aspects about them that had to be ironed out, and a lot of flight characteristics that were only applicable to them. This meant that a lot of pilots just had no idea what they were working with, and probably went in expecting the planes to respond a certain way, but no. This is Cutlass's game, not yours. And you will play by its rules, and no one else's. And the Cutlass went against the grain in many aspects. It caused a lot of accidents, got a lot of people killed, though if it's any consolation, 7 of the F7U-3s survive into preservation. So you can go see them at various museums all across America. It's not a lot, but it's better than nothing. The Northrop YB-35, or sometimes called the XB-35, was an experimental heavy bomber aircraft developed by Northrop for the United States Army Air Forces during and after World War II. Its claim to fame, well, you've probably already noticed, it's a flying wing, a type of aircraft that's notable as lacking a tail section, or even really a fuselage. They are, quite literally, just the wing. And this is a very efficient design technically, as it reduces a lot of drag and eliminates structural weight that isn't directly responsible for producing lift. The aircraft was supposed to have a crew of 9, a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, engineer, radio operator, as well as 3 gunners. At a length of 53 feet 1 inch, a wingspan of 172 feet 0 inches, a height of 20 feet 3.5 inches, with a maximum takeoff weight of 209,000 pounds. They could hit a maximum speed of 391 miles per hour. And for the time, they were very forward-thinking. An extremely ambitious project, but ultimately didn't lead to an actual service life. Despite showing promise, the entire project would be cancelled. And if you ask the designer, Jack Northrop himself, the reason was, not very legitimate, shall we say. The B-35, as a concept, was directly linked to Jack Northrop. This was his baby. He had started work on flying wings all the way back in the 1930s. Some articles have erroneously stated that, no, in fact it was the Germans that were responsible for the flying wing, in the form of the HO-229, which is an entirely separate story, and I mean that. These two aircraft have basically nothing in common beyond, well, both being flying wings. To be honest, the flying wing concept isn't even directly linked to Northrop. The concept of tailless aircraft dates back to the 1910s. The flying wing in itself is not wholly original. Northrop didn't make much headway until 1941, right before the US would enter World War II. Both his company, Northrop, as well as Consolidated Vought Corporation, were commissioned to develop a new long-range bomber. Northrop pushed his flying wing concept, but Consolidated Vought wanted a more conventional design with a proper fuselage and tail, like Coward's. When America really did enter World War II in December of 1941, the Army Air Force decided to award prototype contracts to both Northrop and Consolidated Vought, because, well, I mean, the defense budget was now through the roof because war. But more to the point, they were looking for a bomber that could do a round-trip mission of 16,000 kilometers, 10,000 miles. And the reason for this is that, at the time, there was serious legitimate concern that Britain could still fall. And if that happened, there'd be no staging positions for American forces to actually, attack German-occupied Europe. They would therefore need a bomber capable of transiting the entire Atlantic Ocean and get back again without landing, which was a tall order for the time. Detailed engineering for Northrop's new aircraft started in early 1942. They opted to embed a fuselage-like cabin inside the wing. It also included a tail cone protruding from the leading edge, which would contain the remote sighting stations for the bomber's gunners and a cluster of rear-firing machine guns in the production version of the aircraft. And since the plane was going to be designed for incredibly long range, the midsection actually contained folding bunks for off-duty crew on those longer missions. The bomb load was to be carried in 6 smaller bomb bays, 3 in each wing section, fitted with roll-away doors. Though that original design would preclude the aircraft from carrying very large bombs, inevitably including the early atomic bombs as well, unless of course they would be redesigned, though they never actually were. The aircraft also took advantage of a new aluminum alloy that was devised by Alcoa, considerably stronger than any alloy that had been used previously. But despite being developed for World War II, with the considerations of World War II, the B-35 never actually entered World War II. It wasn't even flight tested until after World War II, almost a whole year after World War II to be precise. In June of 1946, the XB-35 made its first flight. The flight did go well, but the point is the 35 no longer was needed for the war, although it was still needed for the future of warfare. Interest was still pretty high even after the war, plus with the looming threat of the Soviet Union, we were still looking at more bombers, just in case. But this is where the problems and cracks started showing in the B-35, and not necessarily due to anything inherently wrong with it, just certain mismanagement. And it wasn't always Northrop's fault either. The engines and propellers were actually property of the Army Air Forces, and they had not been tested for engine-propeller compatibility by either Pratt & Whitney, Hamilton Standard, or the Army Air Forces, which had bought them without assuring reliability. They just got them and sent them to Northrop, figuring, yeah, it'll be fine. No problem. After 3 or 4 flights, there was an issue involving power plant and propeller vibrations, and it was only getting worse. At the time, the design was using contra-rotated propellers, another innovation to improve efficiency, but they started failing quite frequently. No one would take responsibility for the issues, and the Army Air Forces failed to supply the AC electrical alternator. instead insisting Northrop use the onboard auxiliary power unit that was driven by an automotive engine, which, great, but that limited the high-altitude, high-speed XB-35 to test flights that were always below 15,000 feet, which meant that they literally couldn't get any data on its high-altitude performance at all. The Army Air Forces also refused to allow Northrop proposed modification of the bomb bays to carry the standard Mark III atomic bombs, while at the same time saying that they wouldn't buy the thing unless it could carry the atomic bombs, which... Guys, it's one of the other... What is happening? All these problems compounded, and after only 19 flights, the first XB-35 was grounded, and the second was grounded after 8 flights. Because of the frustration with the whole contra-rotating propeller issue, Northrop just straight up removed them and replaced them with 4-bladed single-rotation propellers. But that didn't fix anything. They still had driveshaft vibration problems, and those props reduced the aircraft's speed and performance. Another continuous issue was the exhaust system on the 35. It was complicated, and it was very difficult to maintain. After only 2 years of relatively infrequent flights, the engines were already showing signs of metal fatigue as a result of this. But Northrop didn't want to give up necessarily, and he did realize another problem was that he was still messing with props. It was after World War II, and jets were on the horizon. He was well aware of this. So exactly 3 of the YB-35s were converted. 2 into YB-49s and 1 into the YRB-49A. These were powered by jets. The first of those flew on October 22nd, 1947, and proved more promising, actually, than the piston-engine version. It even set an unofficial endurance record, staying continuously above 40,000 feet for 6.5 hours. But issues still held back the project, because flying wings were still very uncharted territory, and testing them was a new experience for pilots. The second YB-49 was lost on June 5th, 1948, killing the crew, and the reason seemed to be structural failure at the time. The speculation was that it was lost due to excessive pull-out loads imposed on the heavy airframe when a scheduled flight test of the stall recovery of the aircraft resulted in a sudden and dramatic high-speed nose-over dive. Another test pilot of the YB-49s, Robert Cardenas, claimed that they had a habit of rotating backwards in a stall, and he actually warned the pilot of the crashed 49, Daniel Forbes, about that problem. Northrop countered that such behavior was impossible for an all-wing design, but regardless, the point is, it crashed, and that wasn't a good look. A lot of them were lost in crashes, and that mostly had to do with just the unfamiliar nature involving flying wings. A lot of modern technology has enabled these sort of designs to be utilized in the modern day. A lot of the challenges were overcome when fly-by-wire systems were developed in the 1950s, and computer-generated artificial stability then became available in the 1970s. All this assisted with keeping a flying wing in the air, making it a lot less stressful for pilots, and a lot less likely that you were gonna crash, but Northrop still persisted, at least until both the YB-49 and the YB-35 programs were cancelled, and in early 1950, the remaining airframes were ordered to be scrapped, quite sternly, by the Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington. Symington demanded that all of them be destroyed, going as far as to send crews with portable smelters directly to Northrop's facility and annihilate years of hard work right in front of all the employees. Jack Northrop was devastated by the loss of this project. It was his dream to see an all-wing aircraft succeed. He would retire from both the company he founded as well as aviation entirely shortly after this. His son would later say that his father really felt like he had been screwed over. There had actually been political sabotage involved, as well as backroom wheeling and dealing between Convair and the Air Force. Convair, mind you, was working on the competing design, the B-36 Peacemaker, which was a lot more conventional. It wasn't until 1979 that Jack Northrop himself broke his silence regarding this, and he claimed that the flying wing had been cancelled because Northrop Aircraft Corporation refused to merge with competitor Convair, at Stuart Symington's strong suggestion. The merger was rejected by Northrop because Convair's demands were frankly completely unfair. There was an investigation done by the House Armed Services Committee to see if any of those claims were true, and Symington himself publicly denied exerting pressure on Northrop to merge. And despite Jack Northrop's frustrations regarding cancellation, there was legitimate reason to cancel the project too. They were years behind schedule, and there were still technical difficulties to overcome. The Air Force may have seen the B-36, which was also experiencing a lot of problems, and felt that it was more likely that they could overcome those problems given its more conventional design. Whereas with the Flying Wing, it was still unknown how well it would do. Convair did have much more effective lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and Jack Northrop was notoriously bad at negotiating with politicians, because, frankly, he just didn't like them. All the political nonsense over in Washington annoyed him, and he didn't like dealing with it. The man was an engineer, and he was developing something truly great and didn't have time for all the legal jargon. But Convair did, and because of that, they were able to convince the politicians to keep their project around and get rid of their competitor. Northrop was still given a contract to make up for the cancellation in the form of the F-89 Scorpion, but it was hardly an apology. It was much smaller and much lower profile, not even very ambitious in its way. The legacy of Northrop's Flying Wing could have ended there, and been generally a sad story, but after he retired from aviation, Northrop would dabble in real estate, but he lost much of his personal fortune. By 1976, his health was failing, and deep down, he never really gave up on the Flying Wing idea. He actually communicated directly to NASA his belief in the low-drag, high-lift concept, inherent in the Flying Wing. NASA did reply to him, and said that the idea had technological merit, even encouraging Northrop, telling him that his Flying Wing concepts had not been completely abandoned. At the time, Jack Northrop probably didn't know what they meant, and by the late 1970s, Northrop had a variety of illnesses, and they left him unable to walk or even speak. But shortly before his death, he was given clearance to see a new design being worked on by the descendant of his own company, Northrop Grumman. He was also allowed to hold a scale model of it, known as the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The B-2 shared many design features with Northrop's own YB-35 and YB-49. It even had the same 172-foot wingspan. After seeing what was being worked on, he wrote down on a sheet of paper, "Now I know why God has kept me alive for 25 years. He would pass away 10 months later. Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne was supposed to be an attack helicopter for the United States Army, developed all the way back in the 1960s. It's a curious design with an interesting tail-mounted thrusting propeller on top of the more traditional rotors, but for many reasons the program never really came to fruition. 10 prototypes were built, but the helicopter never entered production, being cancelled in 1972. Why didn't the aircraft see combat? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning. Now you have to understand this was still very much the early days of helicopter development. Prior to the Cheyenne, every single armed helicopter that had entered service had only been modifications of existing helicopters. The first armed escort helicopters that entered the Vietnam War, for example, consisted of 15 UH-1A Iroquois, UEs, which had been modified with systems that allowed for mounted machine guns, grenade launchers, and rocket pods. Which is great, but these weren't designed as dedicated attack platforms. You're just modifying the UEs. And for a while, that continued, actually. In June of 1962, Bell did approach the Army with another proposal, which they called the D-255 Iroquois Warrior. This was meant to be a purpose-built attack helicopter, though even it was still based on the UH-1B airframe, as well as the dynamic components. In December that same year, Combat Development Command, CDC, drafted a Qualitative Material Requirement, or QMR, for an interim commercial off-the-shelf, COTS or COTS, aircraft. This is considered somewhat of an attempt by Army officials to acquire an interim helicopter that could fulfill the armed escort role, until they could figure out exactly what they really wanted in a dedicated attack platform. But the Secretary of the Army actually didn't approve of the interim approach and preferred them to push forward with a much more advanced dedicated system. Based on that, the CDC established the Qualitative Material Development Objectives, QMDO, looking for a rotary wing aircraft with a 195-knot, 224 miles per hour, 361 kilometers per hour, cruise speed, 220-knot, 250 miles per hour, 410 kilometers per hour, dash speed, as well as the capability to hover out of ground effect at 6,000 feet on a 95-degree day, 35 degrees Celsius. And they based the speed requirement off of the aircraft the helicopter was actually supposed to escort. This was conditionally approved, pending review, and the Army was directed to determine whether or not any other helicopter could offer an improvement over the current performance of the UH-1Bs. So Army Material Command, AMC, conducted their own study to determine even if the development objectives were feasible at the time. They recommended that the competition be narrowed to only compound helicopters, as they felt that that was the only helicopter configuration available at that time that could even meet the requirements at all. A compound helicopter is a pretty vague term that just describes a helicopter that has an additional system for thrust, typically including small stub fixed wings. Basically, it could kind of partially fly like a typical airplane would. The Army Material Command would also establish a program office for the Fire Support Aerial System, or FAS. On March 26, 1964, the Army Chief of Staff redesignated the FAS program as the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System, AAFSS. The Development Objectives document was approved in April of 1964, and on August 1st of that year, the Transportation, Research, and Engineering Command contacted 148 prospective contractors with a request for proposals. And they did receive several replies, which included submissions from Bell, Sikorsky, Convair, and Lockheed. The Army would later announce that both Lockheed and Sikorsky were the winners of the Project Definition Phase contracts on February 19, 1965. But at the same time, it was decided that since regardless of which design they went with, this was going to take a few years, and they needed something better right now, they were going to pursue an interim aircraft too, which would result in Bell's AH-1 Cobra, which the original Cobra was basically just a UE modified heavily to be a lot skinnier and carry more weapons. That's really all the original Cobra was, but they worked well for the time. Lockheed and Sikorsky developed both their respective proposals, though eventually the Army decided that the Lockheed proposal would probably be cheaper and easier to develop, so they won out. On March 23, 1966, Lockheed received an engineering and development contract for 10 prototypes, designated the aircraft AH-56A. The deadline for operating capability was planned for 1972, and they had a pretty optimistic target of late 1970 for the aircrafts to really be ready. Construction began almost immediately, and on May 3, 1967, Lockheed held a rollout ceremony for the first AH-56A. The Army designated it Cheyenne, and the aircraft would first fly on September 21, 1967. The Secretary of Defense would later approve pre-production funding to support an initial production order of 375 aircraft on January 8, 1968. All 10 prototypes were built and completed by 1969. Now, the overall design of the Cheyenne is pretty friggin' weird, and it kinda wound up looking a bit like a wasp, if you ask me. Its main features include a rigid main rotor, low-mounted wings, as well as that pusher propeller. It was powered by a General Electric T64 turboshaft engine. At high speeds, the amount of lift provided by the wings was sufficient enough to reduce the aerodynamic loading on the main rotor, to the point that it was only providing about 20% of the lift. The rest was being handled by those wings, and that amount could be adjusted by collective pitch control changes. The Cheyenne could hit speeds up to 230 miles per hour, but because it was a compound, it never qualified for speed records in helicopter categories, since it was kind of cheating. Similar to the vast majority of modern attack helicopter platforms, the Cheyenne had a two-seat tandem cockpit, featuring an advanced navigation and fire control suite. The pilot sat in the rear and the gunner in the front. And a weird thing about the Cheyenne's gunner spot is that the whole thing actually rotated to keep the gunner facing the same direction as the turret. Most attack helicopters don't do that, but the Cheyenne did. Flight testing began in September of 1967, but rotor instability at low altitude and ground effect was noticed immediately. Adjustments were made to compensate for this, and a 13-minute demonstration for the public was held by the Army and Lockheed on December 12, 1967. The Cheyenne was able to demonstrate some of her impressive capabilities, such as the fact that she could slow down or accelerate without pitching the nose up or down at all, because of the pusher propeller. She could also pitch the nose down or up when she was just hovering without causing the aircraft to accelerate forwards or backwards. These were very unique traits for the helicopter at the time, but a major setback would occur on March 12, 1969, when the rotor of prototype number 3 wound up striking the fuselage and caused the aircraft to crash and kill the pilot, David A. Beale. The accident occurred on a test flight where Beale had been instructed to manipulate the controls to excite a 0.5p oscillation, what's known as a half-p hop, in the rotor. A half-p hop is a particular vibration that happens once per 2 main rotor revolutions, where the P refers to the rotor's rotational speed. It was discovered that the pilot-induced oscillations had set up a resonant vibration that exceeded the rotor system's ability to compensate. The Army would issue a cure notice to Lockheed on April 10, 1969, citing 11 different technical problems with the current prototypes, as well as unsatisfactory progress. That half-p hop vibration hadn't quite been solved at that point, and the aircraft always had a major issue with weight. It was just heavier than it was supposed to be. It exceeded the program requirements, and the Army wasn't happy about that. Lockheed proposed an improved flight control system, ICS, to reduce the rotor oscillations, and steps for removing excess weight and addressing other minor issues in the production version. But the Army felt Lockheed's solutions would delay the program and increase costs, which, yeah, that's usually what happens. They felt Lockheed simply could not meet the production timeline, so they wound up canceling the AH-56 production contract on May 19, 1969. Now, that didn't mean development was over, because they did let them keep the development contract. That meant they could continue working on it and hopefully meet the requirements eventually, but it didn't necessarily guarantee the aircraft would enter production. Another setback happened in September of 1969. Prototype number 10 underwent wind tunnel testing at NASA Ames Research Center, looking into the half-p hop as well as drag issues. But the engineers responsible for the tests didn't actually realize that the fixed mounts used to secure the aircraft in the wind tunnel would, in fact, not allow the helicopter to move relative to the rotor, as it would in flight. Because of this, there wasn't any natural damping of the rotor pitching motion, and she was being remote controlled at the time, so there was no sensory feedback, which only made the situation worse. During high-speed testing to replicate the half-p hop issue, the rotor oscillations quickly accelerated out of control again and struck the tail boom, resulting in number 10 also breaking up and crashing. Lockheed still pushed forward trying to figure out the Cheyenne's issues. As a precaution to the fact that they'd already had at least 2 accidents, number 9 was fitted with a downward firing ejection seat, just in case something would go wrong. She specifically would be used for all remaining envelope expansion flights. She also received an upgraded transmission and drivetrain, as well as a hinged rear canopy in place of the original sliding canopy. Prototype number 6 was utilized for weapons testing at Yuma Proving Ground, Arizona, which demonstrated the ability of the gunner and the pilot to accurately fire on separate targets on each side of the helicopter. And towards the end of 1970, the Army funded work on TOW missile guidance and night sighting systems. Number 6 and number 9 would both be tested at Yuma in 1971 to determine if stability and control systems would be sufficient. Deficiencies were identified in lateral directional stability, uncommanded motion during maneuvering, high vibration, as well as poor directional control during sidewards flying. Following these tests, Number 9 received an improved engine, as well as the planned production version of the ICS system. With those upgrades, Number 9 actually surpassed the performance requirements, though under certain conditions, stability and control didn't completely satisfy the test pilots. Lockheed had been working on ways to prevent unstable feedback from the gyro, and the solution was to relocate the thing from the top of the rotor head to below the transmission, with flexible connections to the rotor. It worked and was installed on Cheyenne Number 7 in 1972, but just the previous year in 1971 there was severe increased political friction between both the Army and the Air Force. What does the Air Force have to do with any of this? They weren't involved in the development of the Cheyenne, and that's correct. But the reason why the Air Force was annoyed is that they felt the Army was trying to replace them in the Close Air Support Mission, CAS. It had been mandated in the Key West Agreement of 1948 that that was the Air Force's job, and they felt that the Cheyenne threatened it. The Department of Defense did conduct a study that wound up concluding that the Air Force's latest Close Air Support program, known as AX, which resulted in the A-10 Thunderbolt, the Marine Corps' Harrier, as well as the Cheyenne, were all significantly different, to the point that they didn't constitute a duplication of capabilities, and I'd agree, those are all completely different aircraft and do completely different things. On October 22nd, 1971, the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Tactical Air Power conducted hearings to evaluate the Close Air Support mission, as well as all the pending programs. It didn't go well for the Army, because General William W. Momyer of the Air Force cited very, very bad helicopter casualty statistics from Operation Lamson 719. In response to all this, the Army wound up convening a special task force under General Marks in January of 1972 to reevaluate their requirements for an attack helicopter. The purpose was to develop an updated and defensible material needs document, one the Air Force couldn't constantly poke holes in and annoy them about. The task force conducted flight evaluations of the Cheyenne along with two other industry alternatives, the Bell 309 King Cobra, as well as the Sikorsky S-67 Blackhawk. Tests showed that both Bell and Sikorsky's helicopters couldn't actually fulfill the Army's requirements. Another incident with the Cheyenne that was just nothing but bad luck, but made them look bad, was a weapons demonstration that happened for the Senate Armed Services Committee in early 1972. This was supposed to show off the Cheyenne's firepower and garner support, but the first TOW missile that was fired in the demonstration failed and went straight into the ground. The second missile was fired and hit the target, and that was great, and even before this, 130 TOW missiles had been fired from the Cheyennes without any failures. But that first missile was linked directly to how people were viewing the Cheyenne, which was completely unfair because the failure had nothing to do with the Cheyenne, it was a fault with the missile, not the helicopter. But in April of 1972, the Senate would publish its report on the Close Air Support role. The report recommended funding the Air Force's AX program, the A-10, as well as limited procurement of the Harrier for the Marine Corps. The report didn't actually mention the Cheyenne by name, but it did offer a relatively passive recommendation for the Army to continue procurement of attack helicopters so long as their survivability could be improved. All this came to a head on August 9th, 1972. The Secretary of the Army canceled the Cheyenne program entirely. They cited the helicopter's large size and inadequate night all-weather capability. The Cheyenne had also been developed with analog and mechanical weapons systems, and when they had been built, those were fine, but new digital systems were coming into the fold that were much more accurate, faster, and lighter. The unit costs per Cheyenne had also increased, and if they continued to develop it, incorporating newer avionics, that would probably go up even more. On August 17, 1972, the Army would initiate a new Advanced Attack Helicopter program, called just that, Advanced Attack Helicopter, AAH. This would eventually lead to the AH-64 Apaches, which still serve today in upgraded form. They did wind up getting a very successful attack helicopter, but the Cheyenne never had a chance. And even after the cancellation, the Army did conduct an evaluation of Cheyenne No. 7, which had been equipped with a newer AMCS flight control system. The testing showed that the AMCS removed most of the remaining control issues. It improved stability, improved the handling, and decreased the pilot's overall workload. Cheyenne No. 7 was able to reach a speed of 247 miles per hour in level flight, and in a dive achieved an astonishing 282 miles per hour. This didn't cause the Army to reevaluate their position, though. Prototype No. 7 was the last Cheyenne to take to the skies, and the cancellation was very damaging for Lockheed's prospects. They had been counting on the Cheyennes so they could establish themselves in the helicopter market, and that simply didn't happen. Fortunately, though, 4 of the 10 prototypes did wind up surviving into preservation. No. 2 is on display at Fort Johnson, Louisiana. No. 5 is stored at the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Novosel, Alabama. No. 6 is on display at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And No. 7 is on display, also at Fort Novosel. Many still think that the Army shouldn't have given up on the Cheyenne, and it's hard to judge. There were plenty of reasons against it, but there are plenty of reasons to argue for it. I guess it depends on how you view things. Do you think the Army should have continued spending money on the project? It might have turned out something pretty incredible, sure, but we also wound up with the Apache. And the Apache is also really good, so I mean, what do you want?